Let's look at the recent history of Ukraine, but first let's recognize that the capital of Ukraine, Kyiv, was once the capital of a much older Kievan Rus Empire, which in the Middle Ages eventually grew to the Russian Empire that we know today. There is some historical connection between Ukraine and Russia that obviously can't be ignored. Under the USSR, or the United Soviet Socialist Republics, Ukraine was part of the sphere of Soviet control, and this was until the end of the Soviet Union in the 1990s. Following its independence, Ukraine declared itself a neutral state. It formed a limited military partnership with Russia while also establishing partnerships with NATO in 1994. For those who may have heard the word NATO but don't quite know what it is, NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and was originally created as a mutual defense pact for nations who are fearing Russia and Russian aggression in the post-World War II era. Essentially, that's teaming up with the West. In 2004, Viktor Yanukovych, then prime minister, was declared the winner in presidential elections, which had been largely rigged according to the Supreme Court of Ukraine. Viktor Yanukovych served as the fourth president of Ukraine from 2010 until he was removed from office in 2014 during a revolution. Yanukovych, who had been elected with the help of Russia, rejected the pending EU association agreement, which chose to pursue a Russian loan bailout rather than help from the West, and made closer ties with Russia. In November 2013, a wave of large-scale protests erupted in response to Yanukovych's refusal to sign an association and free trade agreement with the European Union. These protests continued for months. In 2014, clashes between protesters and special riot police became violent and resulted in the death of nearly 130 people, including 18 police officers. Essentially, Yanukovych was put in as a Russian puppet government like we see in Belarus and other places to be closer to Putin rather than the West. And with Putin's help, he ended up trying to put down any protests and speaking out against the closer relations between Yanukovych and the Russians. An agreement between President Yanukovych and the leaders of the parliamentary opposition were signed that called for early elections and the formation of an interim government. The following day, Yanukovych fled from the capital ahead of the impeachment vote. The protesters proceeded to take control of the Capitol buildings. On the same day, the parliament declared that Yanukovych was relieved of duty, 328-0 vote out of the 450 members. Yanukovych said that this vote was illegal and possibly coerced and asked the Russian Federation for assistance. Russia considered the overthrow of Yanukovych to be an illegal coup and did not recognize the interim government. The interim government proceeded to sign an EU association agreement, and then Petro Poroshenko became the president of Ukraine after a landslide victory in 2014. Aside from the Russian involvement in Ukraine and their hope for a friendly partnership, the Ukraine also poses a risk for Russian safety. With the Ukraine becoming more friendly with the West and wanting to join NATO for its own protection from Russia, it would remove the Russian buffer zone between Russia and NATO countries. This would allow NATO weapons and troops to be right on Russia's borders. So some people ask, why now? What's changed recently that this whole war has happened? And I would suggest that after very little response from the annexation of Crimea in the Ukraine and Georgia under previous administrations, and also the attempt by Russia to persuade Trump officials to alleviate some of the previous sanctions against Russia, nothing has really been done to try and stop them. Even though many people debate if Trump was quote-unquote pro-Russia or simply enamored with dictators and strongmen, his actions purposely or more likely inadvertently provided Putin with a great deal of hope in his own future. Trump said about NATO that if they don't spend more on defense, the US would go their own way. And unfortunately, if this was true or not, if Trump really did say this, Putin probably loved knowing that Trump and the allies were falling apart and NATO was not as strong as it used to be. Obviously, he was not so worried about Ukraine trying to join NATO when NATO itself was in internal chaos. In 2020, Trump tried to bring Russia back into the G7 and onto the world stage, which might have been another sign to Putin that his international profile was growing and maybe becoming a little more influential, maybe that he was going to gain some power in the world. Needless to say, this would not be a good time to start a war when you are on the path to possibly getting what you want legally. Trump's infamous call to the Ukrainian president that delayed military and financial support that they required to remain strong against the Russian threat was definitely another sign to Putin. Until Trump was removed from power, Putin had some hope that either he could gain more power and influence legally from Trump, Or at a minimum, Trump would continue to, or out of ignorance, alienate himself from his allies and allow Putin to solidify his power with the nations around him. Possibly once the quote-unquote legal means were gone and NATO returned to being solidified and U.S. administrations were no longer going to praise and appease the Russian dictator, he felt that it was time to start open aggression to reinstall a pro-Russian puppet government in the Ukraine. This leaves us at about the point we are today, where the Russian government has officially started a war to try and remove the Zelensky government, the one who is hoping for closer ties to the West rather than closer ties to Russia. There's been some speculation that the Ukrainians want to join NATO in order to protect themselves from a future Russian aggression just like this, and Russia is definitely not having it. Russia seems hell-bent on the idea of reconnecting themselves as a sphere of influence with a bunch of Soviet Union republics of the past. Ukraine definitely stands in the way of their plans, and the fighting that's happening today to protect their land is just a testament to the fact that those people want to be free and sovereign and not part of Russia. They have also proved in the past that they absolutely do not want to be run by Russian puppet governments, and they want to have a say in their own government. In the end, hopefully some of you can see here the history that is going on, the history that's repeating itself, and make sure that you are aware while we watch the things on the news of how we got to this point today. We will stand behind and pray and help the Ukrainians however we can in order to avoid the pitfalls of the past, where we appeased dictators and appeased autocrats and gave them the land as long as it wasn't ours until it was too late and World War had started. We pray that the next podcast we do will see an end to this current situation and we'll be back to normal and everyone will be safe and healthy and happy and free. This has been another episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to check us out at jdr.podcast on Instagram. We'll see you next time.